few months ago, I asked you to bring me your cars for review, and I got a list that I am currently working through. But when Roy got in touch with me and offered me the chance to drive his beautiful white RX-7, I basically bit the man's hand off. I have absolutely no shame in admitting that when it comes to most things JDM, I am fairly clueless. That doesn't, however, stop me from lusting after most of them. The RX-7 is a car that has always fascinated me, but I don't really know much about them. I went out for a passenger ride in one once a couple of years ago, and that's about it. And I have looked at them in the classifieds a few times, but like many JDM things of late, the prices have gone up and they've just been a little bit too far out of my reach, or just not the right car for me. However, I am told this car is a 1999 Type RS. It has been lightly modified and is clearly very, very well looked after. Modifications to this car have been kept fairly minimal and fairly tasteful. From the outside, it appears reasonably stock. The only giveaways that it aren't are the BBS wheels that look a little bit like those on the Spirit R, and the slightly lower ride height, which is given to the car by the fully adjustable Öhlins DFE suspension. In terms of performance, the car has a new ECU, which allows it to run slightly higher boost, around about 1 bar over 0.75, and it has a 3-inch exhaust, which still has the cat on it. The car's also got an uprated intercooler and a water injection system for track use, which this car does receive despite its absolutely beautiful finish. Now let's be honest here. You think Rotary, and people generally think of two things: epic fuel and oil consumption and chronic unreliability. Well, I've been brushing up on the models as best I can recently, and it seems that at least one of those things isn't entirely true. It does drink both fuel and oil. Fuel consumption in this particular car is mid-teens when you're driving around town and low to mid-20s when you're on a run. Of course, if you're pushing the car, it's going to be lower. Now, those aren't great figures, but to be honest, they're no different to any number of more modern performance BMWs that I've had. And let's be fair to the car here. It is effectively a design from the 1980s. This car came out in very, very late 91, early 92, so it is now at best a 25-year-old car. And if you apply modern standards to something like that, you're all going to be disappointed. On the oil front, yes, the car does use oil, and the recommended oil changes, certainly for a car like this, are around every 3,000 miles. The good news is that the car doesn't require expensive, fully synthetic oil. It will happily drink either mineral or semi-synthetic. Yes, you will need to keep an eye on the oil level, and certainly if you're driving the car enthusiastically, you should expect to top it up between oil changes. But when the oil is not expensive, that really isn't an issue. Most of the problems people have with these cars come down to user error. People not checking their oil levels, people driving it hard and forgetting to top the car up, or simply taking the car too long between services. And let's be honest, if you let any engine run dry or low on oil, it's going to break. So that really isn't something that you can count against Mazda and the Rotary specifically. When it comes to unreliability issues, the RX-7's biggest problem is over-eager users. People start to modify the cars, in particular changing the exhaust, changing the air filter, changing the intercoolers, without doing other sympathetic modifications. This car's Achilles heel for tuners is the ECU. It is a design from the 1980s, and it has very, very limited ability to cope with changes in intake and exhaust. And that means when you try and do that without changing the ECU, the engine will lean out, it'll start running hot, things will go very bad, very fast, and the car will break. Really, that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. You're effectively looking at a 1.3 litre engine that in stock form is producing nearly 300 horsepower. So the idea of being able to get 400 horsepower out of it for free should be seen as perhaps a little bit unrealistic. Of course, you can get 400 horsepower or a lot more out of these cars, but it shouldn't be seen as easy. Do it properly and get specialists to work on it, and you will have a very good performance car that will be reasonably reliable. No, it will not do 250,000 miles because it is not a Honda Accord. It is an early 1990s Japanese performance car, and being brutally honest, the way that it drinks fuel, the performance available out of it, and the running costs are probably not that far off many of its contemporaries. Certainly the people I know that own early GTRs, own Supras, and other cars like that have similar experiences to this. I was looking at Evos myself recently, and they certainly drank easily as much as this, and the people that I know who own Evos told me that there are plenty of things that can go wrong with those. So don't think for any second that the RX-7 is going to be any better or worse than one of those to own. Of course, the really important bit is what it's like to drive, and that's what we're going to find out now. So this car retains unusually the factory sequential twin turbo setup, and the way that works is reasonably simple, but a lot of people get it wrong. You have one turbo that spins from almost idle. It starts spooling up at about 1500 RPM and is then fully on song by about 2000 RPM. The second turbo, which is of equal size, kicks in at around 4000 RPM, and they then both work together all the way to the red line. The idea being that you can, of course, have decent torque low down, and you get a nice shove higher up the rev range when both turbos are working together. A lot of people swap this for a single turbo setup for various reasons. You can ultimately get more power at the cost, of course, of greater lag, and there is the small issue of the 45 feet of pipework under the bonnet that make this system work. And for a lot of people, it's just too much hassle to diagnose it when it goes wrong, so they chuck the whole lot in the bin and just go with a simpler setup. But this car's retained the stock setup, and it feels great. Really nice. So driving this car on a road that I know very, very well and is definitely a typical British B road, the car handles really, really nicely. It's actually a lot of feedback through the steering. It's fairly quick to turn, but not silly quick. It's nice. The car, despite the fact it's on a reasonably stiff setup, isn't actually uncomfortable at all. The seats, again, standard items, are kind of nice and supportive. The aircon in this car also works very, very well. It pulls nicely. Car pulls very strongly all the way to the red line. It sounds kind of nice too, despite the fact it's got a fairly generous exhaust system. It's not crazy loud in here. Part of that's going to be due to the fact that the owner has put a lot of Dynamat in to keep the tyre roar down. It's a lovely place to be though. View out the front is nice. The gearbox is not too bad either, bearing in mind the fact that it is, again, a 20-year-old Japanese gearbox with 85,000 miles on it. One thing notable in here, which unfortunately I can't transmit to you guys very faithfully, is the smell. It smells amazing in here. I think it smells of car. It smells of car in Japan from the 90s. I know exactly what it is. It's probably some horrible, horrible chemicals that are shortening my lifespan dramatically, but it smells great anyway. One of my bugbears with turbos, as those that are frequent viewers of the channel will know, is the fact that when you've got a very highly turbocharged engine, they can have real issues with low speed pickup, the kind of thing that you do when you're just driving in normal situations around town and the like. In this car, because of the way the turbos are set up, you've actually got plenty of pickup and good response from very low RPM. You can still feel the fact that it is turbocharged, but it's pretty nice, especially when you consider the age of the setup. So driving on roads like this, you can feel that the back end isn't completely planted. It's not scary, but you're aware of it. Certainly compared to the Evora, which I've been driving this morning, it just moves around a little bit more than I'd expect it to. Now, part of that is going to be due to the fact that there's just not anywhere near as much weight over the rear as there is with my Evora. You've got a front-engined car, and the car is actually reasonably light. In fact, this car is around 120 kilos lighter than my Evora, which is quite impressive considering that the car doesn't really make use of many exotic materials. There's certainly not really much aluminium, if any. There's definitely no titanium, and the only carbon fiber in here is basically decorative. Interior wise, this car is very, very classic early 90s Japanese. That is to say, black everywhere, Mixture of leather, plastic and fabric, and it's functional. Unfortunately, when this car came out, it wasn't cheap, around £40,000 I'm told, so not many people bought them. In fact, only around 250 of these were officially sold in the UK. Now, there are, of course, a lot more than 250 in the country, because most that wound up here were, of course, imported, like this one, which came to our shores in 2014. It is quite a cramped interior, really, given the fact that the car itself is not small, but it's mostly made up of bonnet, which is very, very tightly packed, and there is a generously sized boot, which is similar in configuration to that in a Corvette coupe. It's very wide and very long, but not very deep at all, so you can get some things in there with great ease, but not others. If you're a paper salesman, it's a great car. Golf clubs, not so much, and large luggage you'd also struggle with. There are also, believe it or not, and I didn't even realize this fact until last week, 2 small seats in the back, but they are so useless that in most markets outside of Japan, the car was in fact sold with plastic storage bins in there instead of seats. And I can see why. My little camera bag's back there, and it's filled the seat up. Given the fact that the car rides very, very snugly on its fairly generously proportioned tyres, it hasn't bottomed out at all in some fairly challenging corners. And the ride is definitely stiff, but not too bad. I'm really enjoying myself here. I think perhaps the main thing that I would say is that despite the fact that when people talk about the RX-7, the rotary engine is the main thing that they discuss, it doesn't feel like a standout part of the car. It's an excellent engine and it works very nicely. I'm paying particular attention to the changeover of the sequential turbos because I don't want to break Roy's lovely car, but it doesn't feel like a great engine bolted to an okay car. The car feels like it's been developed as a whole. It's a real sports car experience. It actually feels much more exotic than I would have expected of something from early 90s Japan. Bearing in mind that Roy takes this car on track quite frequently, it would be very easy to take this car down a path which renders it as a nearly unusable road car. But it isn't at all. It's a really good road car, actually. I'm very surprised, in a good way. The brakes in here are pretty good too. I haven't really given them much thought, which is usually a good thing, because if you suddenly start thinking about the brakes, it usually means they're not very good. But these definitely stop the car. It moves around under braking, but given the fact that Öhlins coilovers aside, this is an almost entirely stock suspension setup, I'm very impressed with it. Really, it's just a car. We've gotten used to cars being so insulated that when things start moving around and cars start doing things that are just mechanical processes, sometimes you worry, but this is what the car naturally wants to do, and it's nice to be able to feel that. Given the fact that Japan is probably best known for making things like the GTR, a car that has a reputation for being very, very digital, and even that's not actually true, this is such a nice car to drive, and you do drive it. So in conclusion, I like the RX-7. I really like this one.